Excellent. So I want to talk today about the workflow plugin suite for Jenkins, and we've had some of these presentations before about various aspects of workflow. We had some where we talked about general user level features, and we did at least one session where we talked about how to write custom workflow steps. So for this, I was asked to talk about a couple of specific topics. One of them is the interaction between security and workflow. And the other topic was how you would go about bringing existing functionality from other plugins that were designed to work with freestyle projects and make those work in workflow. So let me check that we have a fair number of people on here now, so please do jump in with questions. I won't necessarily be able to see if you have questions in the chat or something, so speak up, or Kosuke can let me know if we have some interesting questions from people, or if I'm going too fast or you can't hear me or anything.
Will do.
Excellent. All right, so about security. So the most visible thing that you would, like, somebody needs to be muted in the background. Thanks. So the most visible thing that you would run across when you're working with flows is that you're given two options when you create a flow or you're typing in the Groovy script. You can either turn on security. So
hey guys, I'm hearing two voices.
Like, somebody needs to be muted. Yeah, there's some sort of echo in there. So everybody who's not actively speaking, please mute. Thank you. So we have two choices when you're setting up a flow. You can either turn on the sandbox or not. So if you do turn on the sandbox, then this is going to run every kind of Groovy command or function that you call through a special mode where it's checking whether that particular method call is on a pre-approved list. If you don't, then it's going to go through a different mode where the entire script as a whole needs to be written or approved by some kind of administrator. So to see the whole script approval mode in action, to be useful, you have to set up some kind of security. So if I have some kind of security set up with administrators and then other kinds of developers, let's say that I just add matrix-based security, it'll give administrators all privileges, admin privilege. And then regular developers, I'm just going to give, where's our job permissions? I'm just going to give various job permissions like so. That should be enough permissions. And they'll need overall read permission as well. We'll just save that, log in as a developer, let's say. Yeah, developers cannot administer anything. Yeah, check, make sure that people can still hear me.
Yeah, I think we sorted that out.
Excellent. Okay, so if we go now into the flow configuration and we try to edit the script, and so we're currently logged in just as a developer, then it's going to say a Jenkins administrator will need to approve the script before it can be used. So it depends on what you're trying to do here. Let's say that we're just trying to do some do some basic logic here, and we're trying to say that.
Can you open that help box next to the use Groovy sandbox again? I'm trying to see if this is like understandable enough to people.
It probably needs more.
Yeah, maybe I wonder if it makes sense to have like a link to the wiki page on that describe the concept or need or whatnot.
Yes. So the wiki page is So this page has a kind of fuller description of how script security works in general. It doesn't talk about workflow specifically, but pretty much all of this applies equally well to workflows as well.
So maybe
that could be linked in.
Yeah.
So if I do this and I save it, then without doing anything else, it's not going to let me run it. It's just going to give an exception. You can probably do some work to truncate this down to a one-line error message with a link or something like that. We haven't bothered with that yet. If you log in as an administrator, and you go to the Manage Jenkins page, then you should see that there's a script pending approval. And so you go to that and you say that this user called dev has tried to write something in this job called new flow, and this is the script that they want to use. And so you just say approve, and then you're all done. And then if we go back as a dev and log in, then this time it ought to work. So this time it should say Nexus 3 as expected. And if you go back to the configure page, so as long as we stick with this script, then it's not going to show any kind of warning. But if you make any kind of change, then it's going to say it has to be reapproved. So basically in this mode, you can write anything you want and it could run, but if you're not an administrator, then it's going to be too inconvenient because any kind of change you want to make is going to have to be approved. If you are an administrator, then it bypasses all of these checks as long as you're the one that actually configured it. So if I come in as an administrator, then I can do any kind of change I want. It's not going to warn me as soon as I build it. This should work. And note that here it doesn't matter who started the build, it only matters who the last person to configure the script was. So that's one mode. It makes the fewest changes to how Groovy is run, but it's not very convenient to use in any kind of large secured system because it wouldn't scale very well. So the preferred mode for secured systems is to turn on Groovy Sandbox, and then as a developer, we haven't actually tried this. We'll see if this goes through. So then it should just have allowed me to do this slightly different flow because I'm not really doing anything novel in that case. But if you try to call some other kind of Java method that hasn't been encountered before, is it? I think it's in Java. It's Java util. Let's just try. Just try that one. That works. Not sure if I have the right method name offhand, but we'll find out in a moment. Yep. So in this case, because I tried to call this novel method that we don't know anything about and we don't know what the security implications of it are, this got rejected. And again, we'll probably do some work in the future to make this a single line error with a hyperlink or something like that.
Yeah, I was about to say this. I bet the people will file back reports on this. be nice if this is a little bit nicer.
Yep. So at this point, the administrator is going to see that instead of a script pending approval, there's a signature here of some Java method. We could probably make enhancements here, like see if this is something in the Java platform, you could link to JavaDoc or something like that. In general, this could be any method in the Java platform, or it could be in Jenkins core, or it could be in various Jenkins plugins. So any kind of method or constructor or anything like that that hasn't been pre-approved, you would just approve like that. So you just click yes, as long as it is in fact seems like something harmless. So creating a new UUID is harmless. And so now if we go, then it should allow it to go through. So it created a new random UUID and printed it. And in this case, it makes no difference who configured the flow. So I didn't actually have to go and reconfigure the workflow. And it doesn't matter who started it. It just matters that this thing has been approved. And even if it were an administrator who configured it, it would still have to be an approved signature because it doesn't keep track of who configured it, just keeps track of what methods are allowed. So that's the basics of script security. There's a little complication here. I think I can't show it until I edit the script a little bit. So if you think of another method to call, how's that? Okay, call mathmax. I don't think this is covered by anything yet. So mathmax of 3 and 7, we'd expect that to be 7, but if we build it, it probably is not in any kind of approved list yet. So let's see if that's true. Yep, so Java-lang mathmax of 2 integers is not approved. So when you're offered to approve it, normally you just click approve if it's in fact harmless. There's another option here which is approve using permission check. And this is a little bit trickier. This you would never want to do this for something in the Java platform. But this would be used for a method call in Jenkins core or plugins which already does an access control check. So something like, say, deleting a job or getting some information from a particular build or something like that would require, in general, would require some sort of access control check. Maybe certain administrators could do it, but not other users, etc. So if that's the case, then you would do this, and then the flow will only pass if it is being run with those actual permissions. So in order for this to work, you...
Sorry, I don't know if I follow here. So what
Sure.
So you said, so what it does is it lets the method get invoked, but it does some kind of extra permission check?
Yeah, so it lets the method get invoked, but only if you're actually running as a real user, which in the default setup right now we're not running as a real user. So as in the default setup, the actual flow is just sort of run under the Jenkins system account, so it's not associated with any particular user. Somebody might have triggered the build, or it might have been triggered on schedule, but there's no other user identity associated with it. So if something is in here, then it will only be allowed if we are running with a particular user account. And in order to set that up, you have to do some further configuration, which we don't currently do out of the box, which would probably be bundled in a future version of Jenkins, etc. So this is sort of stuff that's in progress. In order to have this happen, you have to have a plugin which can authorize projects. Currently, there's only one. It's called Authorized Project Plugin. And if you configure security, then you have to go and under access control for builds, you have to enable that this plugin works. Again, this is something that might be done by default in future versions of Jenkins. And there needs to be some configuration in the flow that actually associates it with a user. So if you click on Configure Build Authorization, then it gives you a few choices of how to associate a build with a particular user. Probably the most useful mode is run a specific user, and then you specify who that user is. And then there are various sanity checks to make sure that you actually are that person or that you're allowed to do things on that person's behalf. So if you configured that, then the whole build would actually be running under the credentials of this user account, and then any access control checks would run according to that user. This doesn't currently work because the Authorized Project plugin doesn't support it, but that's something that we'll fix in the future. So this is sort of a mode that is under development but is not yet ready for general purpose use. So I think that's enough about that. There's a sort of related question of what permissions are checked if you do something like build another project. So if you have some other freestyle project or another workflow or something like that, and you ask to build it, then you need to be able to check the permissions to make sure that somebody is actually allowed to trigger the build of that project. So currently, again, that's not checked. That's a filed bug that'll be fixed. So once this permission check is done, and the Authorized Project plugin allows you to give a user identity for this current project, then we'll be able to take this user, so the user configured for this upstream project, like admin here, and do a check on this other downstream project to see if that user has the right build permission for it. So that's the intended future security model. Needs a few bug fixes before we get there. I think that's about it as far as security goes. There are a couple other sort of miscellaneous things about the input step. So there's one filed bug that if you are allowed to stop the current build, then you should also be allowed to cancel input, in addition to the people who are normally allowed to approve it. And for people using Jenkins Enterprise, there's also a request for enhancement to allow the use of role-based access control to determine who should be allowed to approve a given input step. Though currently it's limited to particular users or external groups like LDAP or Active Directory groups. That would be the allowed submitter field here. Right. Anybody have questions so far about security stuff?
So I know I don't think you covered this, but I was thinking about this security running, I guess, not running in sandbox and the version control, like DSL inside the repository. I think you said right now it automatically runs inside Sandbox, and you don't have any option to do it otherwise. But given the isn't it still worthwhile to have that option? Given that, do you feel like Sandbox is good enough to?
I think so. We definitely need to do some more fixes in Sandbox, but I think it's generally usable for stuff. So Kosuke was asking about this mode. So this is the new feature in 1.2 where you can choose to load the entire script from some kind of version control repository and then just load a particular script file from that SCM. So this is currently limited to always run in the sandbox because it's expected that the contents of the script that you load might change at any time outside Jenkins. And so it would probably be difficult to ensure that a whole script always gets approved. Technically, it could use whole script approval, but it would mean that anytime you checked in a change to flow.groovy, Jenkins has no way of knowing before the next time it runs that you haven't made some sort of malicious change to the script, whoever checked that in. And so it would you'd basically have to go back to the script approval screen every time and sort of approve every script change without the benefit of like get diff window or anything like that.
Yeah, but I mean,
so it's possible. It's just not a very attractive option.
I mean, on the other hand, it's no worse from just typing it in there, and then so it's not. I don't think we expect it workflow script to change all that often anyway. Or I mean, just because it's in SCM doesn't mean it changes more often than when it's neutral.
Right.
So
yeah, that's a possible added option. So I'm hoping it will be the less useful option, but if people need that, it's possible to add it.
I suppose it partly depends on how good the default whitelisting in the sandbox is. If every workflow needs to like approve 5 different things.
Yeah. Right. So the hope is that as we get a bit more experience, that this window only shows signatures which were manually approved by the administrator in this Jenkins instance. There's a whole bunch of other things that come pre-approved that have already been vetted by Jenkins developers as being safe for anyone to run. And so the hope is that over time that list of pre-whitelisted methods will grow to cover most things that people would write in a workflow on a day-to-day basis. But there's always going to be some things that don't show up in there. So
maybe we can have some button to let people submit this list to us so that we can look at them.
Yeah, review proposals. Yeah, that's probably possible. So for any kind of sort of exotic computation, you can always fork a process in a slave workspace and do other work inside of that. So this is for things that would be useful within the logic of the workflow itself, which should normally be limited to sort of starting up slaves and triggering other jobs and checking test results after they've been run and that sort of thing. Let's see. I think that's all to say about that. Any other questions about security stuff?
One question about the authorized plugin, Jesse. There, when you select run as a specified user, can you use credentials plugin to pick a user?
No, because this is actually Jenkins user account. So this would need to be a login in your LDAP server, say, or something like that. It's not credentials would be used when you're saving, say, a password to log into some kind of external server, whereas this is about who should be checked against against the permission matrix here or in whatever your authorization strategy is. So in this case, it's going to look up that the flow is running as admin, and then it's going to say, okay, check admin has all of these permissions. Any of these kinds of operations inside Jenkins should be allowed.
Oh, I see. So okay, so this is within the context of Jenkins, which
Yes.
user you want to run as. I see. Okay.
There is potentially some interaction with the credentials plugin because credentials defines its own permissions that you can see here for doing particular things like retrieving the value of certain credentials within some scope. It will probably need to do some more work here to make this fully usable, but you may need to do something like restrict the set of people who are permitted to use a particular server login from their workflows or something like that.
Okay.
I think currently the steps which use credentials, I believe, don't take into consideration the user identity, if any, associated with the build. They just assume that if the workflow configuration itself is in a job that that would otherwise have access to those credentials, that can use them, and just leaves it at that. That may need to be refined.
So on that topic, in a workflow, can I, like if I am checking out source code from SVN, for example, can I use a credential plugin to authenticate to SVN?
Yes. So if we go into snippet generator and select an SCM such as Subversion, then you would be able to pick some kind of credentials here, and if you generate the corresponding step, there's a bunch of default stuff that can be trimmed out, but it's what should have passed in. Somewhere here it should have had the credentials that just picked. I'm not sure why it's not showing up right now. Normally that would come under the, maybe because they left this blank. Just pick a random URL or something like that. Yeah, okay, I guess it ignores the module if I left it blank. So if you define that, then it's selecting a particular credentials ID, like so.
Got it. All right, cool.
And there is a recent change, by the way, to allow you to specify a particular ID here, so that if you want to specify an ID rather than letting it be generated, then it would produce a more memorable or reviewable flow script like that.
That is great, actually. I remember a couple of customers asking for that, so that's a good feature.
Yep. So any kind of integration with credentials that the underlying SCM plugin has is going to work exactly the same way. So with Mercurial or with Git, it should be the same.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sure. Anything else on security?
So on the previous topic, is there a plugin that lets you run a shell script as a different user? Like if I'm running a job on a slave, and on that slave, I don't want to, well, that's a tricky one. I don't want to run as the user that the slave is running as, but as a different user.
I don't believe there is a plugin that really handles that properly, or if there is, I don't know about it. There are probably a few. There are two general approaches to this. One of them is that the entire slave agent runs under a specified user account, and so you just provide a way to start up a slave agent on a given machine under a given user account, and then anything run by that slave agent, any builds it starts, etc., all run under that account's permissions. The other approach would be to have a generic slave agent that starts up on some machine and then is capable of basically making everything be wrapped in sudo. So, I mean, it would be something like you could always run this by hand.
Yeah, I think one of the usual common technique is to run another slave on the same box in another user.
Right.
That
would be the first approach. Yeah.
Okay.
That's probably the most straightforward. It's also conceivable that some plugin could wrap everything that you run so that when you have a command that you write like this, it would really substitute something like that to run under a different account. To make that work would require some more effort to deal with the permissions on workspaces and some other stuff. But it's definitely something that we've thought about doing, but there's nothing specific there yet.
Yeah, maybe you can do the sudo as a block statement.
Yeah, you could. I mean, the problem with actually writing this in your flow is that it's entirely optional. So if this someone is someone who has fewer permissions in general than you do, it's nobody or the nobody user or something like that, and you're in the right sudoers group and can actually run this command, then fine. But the more interesting problem is when the administrator of Jenkins wants to enforce that everything run by this flow or similar flows within a folder all runs under this account and doesn't have an option to escape to other accounts. So that's harder to do correctly. So that's most easily handled today just by starting a new slave agent under the other user account and giving people access to that slave.
Yeah, that seems to be reasonable to ask, to say, run a slave as a certain user, and you can run multiple slaves, I guess, so on the same box. So, yes. I think that's reasonable.
Yeah, you get a bit of overhead per additional slave, but in terms of memory and startup time, but right. I think that's the only major downside to it. Plus ideally, you'd have some system for managing all of these slaves and starting them on demand with certain accounts or something like that. But if it's a small system, that would work reasonably well.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Sure. All right. I guess I'll try to move on to plugin compatibility issues.
Go for it.
Sure. So first of all, the general state of the world as regards plugin compatibility is all posted here, and so you see a lot of existing or proposed integrations with workflow and their status and issue trackers and things like that. So I'll just sort of go over what these different categories are and what it means for a plugin to be called compatible with workflow, or what would need to be different for it to be compatible. So the first category, which is probably the most obvious, is SCM plugins. So when you go, well, actually, I'll back up a little bit. The most obvious integration is that there is a custom step for workflow for this plugin that does something specific, and only does that in workflow. So it may be reusing some code from elsewhere in the plugin, but the only purpose of this code addition is to exist inside a workflow. So an example of this is that if you install the Parallel Test Executor plugin, under sample steps, you would get a new step here called split test. I can actually install it right now, and you'll see it show up. So the set of steps that are present in workflow is just whatever steps happen to be registered by installed plugins. And of course, workflow plugins install a bunch of steps, but there's nothing limited to those plugins. So any plugin which declares a dependency on this module, which has no other dependencies outside Jenkins core, is allowed to register a new step. And the basic thing that you create is just called step, and it goes through a bunch of classes in terms of how it actually runs, but basically it doesn't have any direct references to specific things about workflow. It just talks about how to run stuff, where to send output. And so this is really similar to the API called task in Ant, or in a Maven plugin it would be called Mojo, I think, or something like that. So it's just a general purpose unit of execution. So we installed that plugin, and if you go and configure your flow and you look at the snippet generator, then now we shall see a new entry here, split tests. It looks like I forgot to add documentation for it, but you can configure a couple of options which would be similar to an existing feature for freestyle projects, but not exactly the same. And if you configure it, then it will give you a little snippet that you can put into your flow script. And there's some demos out there of using this particular step. So that's one example. The most direct support is just to add a custom step, and then that shows up for people using workflow. Has no impact on people who aren't using workflow. And then you can provide whatever kind of functionality you want. So the rest of these things deal with cases where you don't necessarily want to have a dependency on workflow APIs in your plugin. You don't want to write new code just for workflow that's not going to be that's not going to be used in the course of running this feature in a freestyle project. You just want to make sure that whatever you're already doing is available also for workflows and should behave the same way as it would in a freestyle project. So one category of these things is SCM plugins. And you can see these pop up if you select General SCM. I'm not sure why CVS appears here. It's not supposed to. That's a bug, and that's a bug in the form, basically. But if you install a compatible SCM plugin, then the name of the SCM will appear here, and you can configure it and see the corresponding Groovy, and you're able to use that SCM to check out from a workflow. In order for this to happen, the SCM plugin needs to make some changes. And these are things that are available with sufficiently new APIs in Jenkins core. So in the case of the SCM stuff, you need to be at least on Jenkins core 1.568. So this was a weekly build running up to the current 1.580 LTS line. So if your plugin depends on a sufficiently new Jenkins, then in this case you just basically collect deprecations and you change a few method parameters around and do a few other things like this. So we get a list of kinds of changes you might need to make here. There are a few more sections down here. So if these changes are made, then the SCM still works exactly the same for a freestyle project, but in addition, it shows up as an option for workflows as well. And the reason that you need to make changes are because within a workflow, unlike in a freestyle project, there's not a single SCM that's bound to the project permanently and that is sort of automatically run through checkout before any of your own build steps run. So in a freestyle project, you just pick an SCM as part of the project definition, and it always does that checkout at the start of the build, and you have no control over when or what happens before that. And you have no ability to do multiple checkouts of different things at different times. In a workflow, it's more flexible, so you can have one slave where you do a get checkout and another slave where you do a subversion checkout. You could do these in parallel, or you could choose one or the other to do at a given time, or anything like this. You can do some stuff before the checkout, after the checkout. You can repeat the checkout. You can check out a bunch of modules all at once, etc. So because this changes the expectations that Jenkins had of where workspaces are and things like that, you need to make some changes to the SCM plugin so that it doesn't make quite as many assumptions.
As an interesting aside there, how do you trigger a workflow build from an SCM commit?
Right. So the answer is that's sort of magic. So if you so let's say that you set up SCM polling hourly. This is the exact same UI control that you would use in a freestyle project, and the same REST endpoints would be available for, I think it's called /get/notify commit or something like that. So that would be there's a REST API here that says, that you can pass it a URL to something or other, and it will give you some sort of message about whether it found any jobs using that Git repository, and whether it triggered any of them, etc.
So
So
if you're using multiple Git repositories throughout the workflow, if any of them had a change, it will just trigger the whole workflow. Is that correct?
That is correct. So yes, you can have Git being checked out in different workspaces. You can have it being done multiple times. You can have all sorts of fancy setups, but if and when the last build of the workflow did actually wind up checking out from one or more SCM repositories, then the workflow keeps track of what those repositories were, and it uses that to decide how to do SCM polling.
Okay, so they're registered with the notifier.
Yep.
Okay, fine.
Yep.
Good.
So one little detail about that is that the first build will never be triggered automatically. So you always have to kick off the first build manually, because otherwise it has no idea what to do.
And
But after that, it should just sort of continue to fix itself up because it just keeps track of any changes to your script.
And there's did you cover the poll switch?
Yep. Right. So the poll SCM, this just means that on some schedule, say every hour, it's going to look for new changes in any of the repositories that you last checked out in your last build. And you can, depending on the SCM, you may also need to have this mode enabled even if you rarely, if ever, actually do the check just to get commit notifications from the REST API also.
Okay, so if a customer was using, so they've got a core application build that was in one area of in one SCM, and they've got a whole bunch of deployment scripts that they're running that are coming from another SCM, changes to either of those can be made to trigger the whole workflow to rerun.
Right. And you can, and by default, it also shows up in the change logs. So just like a freestyle project, you get a change log with the difference that it might have entries from multiple repositories in it. For each time you do a checkout, you can specify whether or not you want it to be shown in the change log and whether you want this to be considered as part of polling for the future. So if you do have if you have some sort of utility library that changes all the time, but it's not worth rebuilding the whole application just because of a change in that, for example, then you could turn off polling and maybe even change log for it. But by default, those are left on because it's assumed that a change in anything might be significant.
Thank you.
Sure. Right. So that was one kind of possible integration is with SCM plugins. The next sort of obvious integration is anything that would show up in a freestyle project under the build steps or post-build actions list. So in Jenkins APIs, these are builder and publisher, respectively, both of which sort of share a common interface, although they get shown at different places. And in order to make these work in workflow, then again, you need to have a somewhat newer Jenkins API dependency. In this case, it's 1577. And you need to implement a special interface called SimpleBuildStep. And this is basically a contract saying that, yes, I have this build step, and I'm going to let it be run whenever you ask for it to be run on, basically any slave, any directory, anytime. You're given, the only guarantees you're really given is that it's somehow associated with a build of something, and you can send some output around and have ways of running external programs and things like that. So for some build steps, it's a pretty easy conversion. For others, it's not as simple. Some build steps and publishers actually assumed that they were being run at a particular point in the process of a freestyle build, and so they might make assumptions about other things that they can get access to at that point. And so if they make those assumptions, then they can't be used in workflow. But if they basically just can be run and do something and it exits, then you can implement this interface and it becomes usable. So if you add some of these from a plugin, then it shows up currently under General Build Step, and then there's a list of possible steps you can take with the same labels that you would see in a freestyle project. This doesn't have. There's some others and other plugins I don't have installed right now. But so for example, if you If you select email notification, then it would give you the syntax for running the mailer step. And so this is going to run the exact same code that the corresponding post-build action would run in a freestyle project, for better and for worse. So in some cases, it makes sense to create a special step for workflow that has a different set of options. So sometimes steps have options which only make sense because of the way freestyle projects are set up. So specific ways of having the step make decisions for you that you can't really, that you couldn't otherwise select in a freestyle configuration page. So some of those things don't make sense in workflow where you could just, where this is just a line in a program and you can pick up some variables from wherever you like and do some if statements if you want to make decisions. But this is the option for pulling in functionality from other plugins without that, for build steps without doing a lot of custom work, without having any code that's only run inside a workflow. So questions about that? Skay and I have been talking about ways to get rid of the class syntax. So currently this specifies which step in the same configuration as a freestyle project that you want to run. So in the future we might have a streamlined syntax for these. We can settle on a way of doing it. And then sort of along the same lines, build wrappers in freestyle projects are things that show up. Let me see if I can make an example. I'm not sure if I have to install something to get some. If you have a freestyle project, okay. That's project options. No, I guess there's no. I guess I would need to install something to make build wrappers be available. But here I'll install maybe the XVNC plugin as a good example of this. Install XVNC. Go back and reconfigure this freestyle project. And we should see a new checkbox, build environment. So this build environment shows up when you have at least one build wrapper available for a freestyle project. So for a freestyle project, if you select something here, it's not a step run at a particular time during a build. It's something that does some preparation work when the build starts, and then usually it does some teardown work when the build finishes. So in the case of XVNC, this is a virtual X window display system so that you can run things like Selenium tests or other kinds of GUI tests on a headless server. So if you select this option, then it does some work to create a new virtual display on the slave at the beginning of the test, and it sets an environment variable with a display environment variable that you can then use within your build. And then when the build is over, it tears that all down and destroys the display. So this kind of thing can also be supported in workflow in the future. This is still a work in progress because you're getting some Jenkins core APIs in place for this. And so, for example, this issue tracks the status of the XVNC plugin in particular. So the way this will show up is that, again, unless we come up with a more streamlined syntax, there will be a general build wrapper option here. And then then instead of selecting a build step, you'd select a build wrapper, which would be run xvnc during build, and then this other configuration would appear underneath it as well. And then the result of this would be something like the following. So you grab a slave, and then on your slave you would run a build wrapper. I think it's just called xvnc. You can give it some options. And rather than being a single build step which does something and then exits, it's a block scope step, just like Node. So it sets up an environment and then tears it down at the end of the block. So this is without display. This is, again, without display, but inside here, you can run any kind of command that requires a graphic display. Like xterm pops up a terminal. And this is going to have a display variable set. So this is how you would be able to reuse the sort of complicated functionality in the xvnc plugin that allocates these displays and checks for conflicts with other jobs and sets up your .x authority and all kinds of other details you really don't want to know about. That just boils down to wrapping your stuff in this block. And again, it's a little bit more general than a freestyle project because you can do this multiple times in different nodes, and you can do stuff inside or outside of the block. So you have some more flexibility.
Does that ampersand work?
Yeah.
That's a shell thing. And then like does it keep? Oh, okay. Well, I guess
it's not very useful in this case because as soon as you run xterm and this will exit, and then we'll tear down the display, and then the xterm will see that it lost its display and exit itself. You can do it. Yes.
So the shell will terminate before it kills the child process? Okay.
Yep.
Yes, I didn't know.
I think that works, yeah. So you can actually do, I think it's called a take screenshot or screenshot. There's some option to pick a screenshot at the end. You can actually, if you do xterm and like this, I'm not running in a version of Workflow that has all of this code integrated, but if you do a flow like this, when that's ready, after this runs, it will have an artifact of the build, which is called screenshot.png. And if you look at the screenshot, you'll see a little terminal window still just about to die. So that category covers a few plugins. It's a smaller set than of plain old build steps, but some of these like xvnc are pretty important. Triggers are not terribly interesting. It's sort of minor changes that that need to be made for build triggers, so I don't bother with that. The other major category of plugins that might need some special work with Workflow is cloud providers. So these are plugins that define a special kind of slave and a special way of launching those slaves on demand. So there are kind of two considerations for cloud providers, both of which have to do with the fact that workflows can be long-running. So a workflow can not only be long-running in general, but it's expected that the particular stuff that gets run inside a shell or batch script could be itself really long-running. So if this command takes 13 hours and care about you might in fact have xvnc running, and maybe you're doing something like running Selenium tests. So you're running Selenium tests on the slave with your special display setup, and you expect this command to take about 13 hours on average. And so you started it up, and then half an hour into it, there's some sort of network problem, and the slave drops offline for a minute and then comes back up. And then a couple hours later, somebody asks to upgrade some plugin, and you decide you need to restart Jenkins. And so you need to do all of these things, but you don't want to interrupt this actual command. This is your important command that you're wasting, or you're spending real CPU time on, so you don't want to have to redo it. So the idea is that this command should be running sort of semi-permanently on that slave machine, and Jenkins is doing nothing more than sort of checking up on it from time to time to see if it's done yet and collecting any output. So for a cloud provider, that means two things. One is that if it adds a slave to the system and Jenkins gets restarted, then it needs to still have that information about the slave it was connected to after it comes back up. So for example, with the EC2 plugin, it decides it needs to add a new EC2 slave to Jenkins, and it has a particular hexadecimal ID of that machine on the network in EC2. So that information has to be saved in Jenkins configuration. After the restart, it's going to have to go back to that same machine that you hope is still up and running and doing work in EC2 and reconnect to it and pretty much just start up where it left off. So sometimes a cloud plugin needs to make some changes to make sure that actually survives a Jenkins restart. And the other kind of change that's sometimes needed is that if you have a cloud provider, let me see if I think I have one, a test one in here. You have the mock slave plugin installed that you can use to demo some stuff. So if you say add a mock cloud, and you leave number of executors at 1, then it goes into the special mode that some cloud plugins have, where the slave is only good for a single build. So as soon as the build is done, the slave is supposed to be killed right away and taken out of the pool and never reused for another build. And for workflows, it needs a slightly different API to make sure that that really works, and that it that basically every time you run a node block, it allocates a slave, and then the slave goes away at the end of the node block, but not before then, and especially not if you restart. So that's why these are listed in the compatibility section. Under miscellaneous, I just have other plugins that do something that might be somehow related to workflows that might need some special work. Any other questions about plugin compatibility stuff?
So I'm going to say, just going to feed back so everyone knows that we did some testing on the EC2 plugin yesterday, myself and Valentina, with various killing of the master and restarting, and we found out the EC2 one does actually work really well. The jobs allocated to those slaves keep running, and it does reconnect at the end, which is good to know.
So I could probably add this just to say EC2, yes, works. In that case, no specific changes needed, so that's good. Any other questions about plugin compatibility? I guess we're done if there's nothing else.
Okay, so I guess I'll stop